Usually I separate all these videos into different sections, like we might have a video on plot and a video on character and theme and symbol and all those sorts of things. And in this story I find that everything's really tied together. I think that the style is really important to what's going on in the story. So instead of having a bunch of short videos, we might end up having one long video if I can go for that long without screwing up over and over again. So this might be a little bit rougher in parts, but bear with me. I just want to talk about, at the beginning, we could start talking about plot, and is this a plot-centered story, a plot-driven story, or is it a character-driven story? And if you ask yourself, what are the main events of the story? Are there really any events at all? And I would say, probably not. We start off in a train station, right? In a little cafe or bar area, and they order drinks. They talk about what drinks to order or not. They have this conversation about the abortion, but no real events happen, right? We have two characters, the man and the woman. The man is unnamed, and again, we can think about who gets names and who doesn't get names, because we've had stories now a couple of times where main characters are named or are not named, and that's something interesting to think about. But we have the man and the woman, we have the bartender who comes in and serves the drinks. But really nothing's happening, so I think that this is less of a plot-driven story than it is a character-driven story. And I think that the form of the story is also interesting, and I think the form, you'll hear me say, form informs content, and if we're talking about a character-driven story, all we really have in this story is the one character interacting with the other character, and the form of the story helps facilitate that, because it's really, in some ways, it's less like a short story than it is like a play, because we have a whole lot of dialogue. I mean, if you pull out the packet and just skim through it, or just look at it, you don't even have to read. If you look at these pages, it's line after line after line of dialogue. There's very little exposition. There's a little bit, the largest paragraph of the whole story, I think, is the first paragraph, kind of setting the scene. And then it's just dialogue, dialogue, dialogue. And then that way it seems sort of like a play, almost like a one-act play, right? And the dialogue is very spare. I mean, the exposition is very spare. There's almost no extraneous prose. It's just character speaking to character, back and forth, back and forth. And Hemingway is so spare that a lot of times we don't even have dialogue tags. And when I say dialogue tag, I mean like he said, she said, jig, the man, all those sorts of things. A lot of times we just have piece of dialogue beginning to end and no he said or she said. And so it's just up to you to sort of figure out who's speaking to whom. You have to go back and forth in your head. So Hemingway, when he writes, he doesn't use a lot of extraneous words, right? So this probably feels very bare to you. And that's part of his style, and we'll talk about his style a little bit later. But when we're talking about the form of the story and it being a character-driven story, all we really have is one character interacting with another character, sort of like they're on stage. And if you read the David Joss article that I gave you, from long shots to X-rays, he talks about how this is almost like eavesdropping. We can think about who the narrator is, and it's not a first-person narrator, right? It's not either one of these characters. These characters are being talked about in the third person: he, she, jig. And he refers to this almost like, for the bulk of the story, we eavesdrop on their conversation just as we might in real life. So this idea of eavesdropping, like we could be in that little area in the train station listening to this conversation happen. Which I think is an interesting way of looking at it. Because all we really have is a dialogue, and when you're eavesdropping, you don't get a lot of what's happening in a person's head. You just have the actual words that the people are saying to each other. So I think that's kind of cool. In some ways, it can be a difficult story to follow, partly because of the operation that's not named, and that throws a lot of people for a loop. But then also the spareness of the prose and just having the dialogue. Because a lot of times we're used to a bunch of detail, right? We describe everything that's on the walls, or we describe all of the landscape, but we don't have a lot of that here, right? And we don't really have, we know what the characters feel about each other, but that doesn't come from the exposition, right? From the big paragraphs of description. That comes from the actual dialogue itself. And I think Hemingway does a really great job of getting that tone, the tone of the characters across, with just words. Maybe you all have experienced this when you send an email or a text message and it's misinterpreted, right? Because people don't get your sarcasm when you're sending an email or something. I know that's happened to me. I sent an email out to my class last semester teasing some girl that she was going to fail the class because she kept asking questions one day. And then I had a couple students who came in and thought that she was actually going to fail the class because they couldn't pick up on the tone. But if you read this and you read it carefully, I think you realize that there's a lot of tension between Jig and the man, right? And so let's think about what that tension is. If you watch the first video, you realize that they're talking about, the operation they're talking about is an abortion. So that's the main point of tension in the story. Obviously, that's a big deal. Who wants it? Who doesn't want it? Well, the man definitely wants her to have it, right? He says, oh, I don't really care, but I think it would be good for you. It's perfectly simple. It's safe. People have these things all the time, whatever, whatever. And Jig seems to not want it. I mean, in some ways, she's kind of ambivalent, but I think, deep down, she really does not want to have the operation. She does not want to let the air in, as it's referred to on 275. And because I keep talking on and on and on, I'm going to stop here so I can gather my thoughts, and we'll continue in a new direction in the next video.